Cops arrest black woman stunned when she is the judge presiding over their case. Ava Sterling stood before the mirror in her small but impeccably decorated apartment, adjusting her navy blue blazer. The tailored suit fit perfectly, hugging her curves in all the right places while maintaining the polished professionalism that had become her second skin. As an assistant district attorney in one of the city's most prestigious firms, Ava knew that first impressions mattered more than anything else. In a world where she had to constantly prove herself, where her worth was often measured by the color of her skin rather than the sharpness of her mind, appearances were a necessary defense. Her reflection was a reminder of everything she had fought for, every sleepless night studying law, every subtle, painful comment she had brushed off from colleagues, every glance that conveyed doubt rather than support. As an African-American woman in a world dominated by white faces and voices, she had learned early on that success wouldn't come easily. The law was her weapon, her way of fighting back, not just for herself, but for the underserved communities in her city that had long been silenced. Ava had seen the scars of injustice firsthand, people wrongfully convicted, victims of systemic inequality, and those whose voices had been ignored simply because of where they came from or the color of their skin. Ava's rise had been marked by her determination to bring justice to those who had been overlooked by the system. She had become known for her sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to fairness. However, the legal world, for all its idealism, was still bound by the same prejudices that plagued the city streets. Despite her accomplishments, she knew she had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. She wasn't just fighting for convictions, she was fighting for respect, for acknowledgement of her ability, and for a place in a field that had historically been closed off to women like her. Her phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her out of her thoughts. Ava picked it up and read the message quickly. Meeting in 30 minutes. Make sure you're ready. It was from her boss, the district attorney. She had been working on a high-profile case for weeks now, an infamous drug cartel that had been terrorizing the city. Today they would present their findings in court, and this trial could be the turning point in her career. She needed to be sharp, and she needed to win. As she walked out the door, her mind raced through her case notes. This wasn't just any trial. This was a battle for justice, a chance to dismantle an organization that had been poisoning the lives of too many people in her community. It was her opportunity to show the world that the legal system could work for everyone, not just for the privileged few. Outside, the air was thick with the weight of the city, traffic humming, voices shouting, the occasional siren in the distance. Ava's heels clicked against the pavement as she walked briskly toward her car, her thoughts still focused on the upcoming trial. She didn't see him at first, but when she looked up she spotted him across the street. Caleb Foster. Caleb stood in his uniform, his arms crossed as he leaned against the side of his police car, tall and broad-shouldered with messy dark hair and a stern expression. He looked every bit the image of the tough cop, but there was something different about him, something in the way he carried himself, like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. It was a look that Ava had come to recognize. She had met him during an earlier investigation when they were forced to work together on a case. He had been distant then, his answers curt, his eyes guarded, but something about him intrigued her. It wasn't just the way his smile softened when he saw her, or the way his deep voice seemed to resonate in a way that made her heart skip a beat. It was the vulnerability she sensed beneath the hardened exterior, something he tried hard to conceal. Ava wasn't sure what it was, but she knew he was hiding something, and that made him all the more intriguing. Caleb nodded in her direction as she approached. "Morning, Ava," he said, his voice deep but warm. His eyes flickered with a hint of something more than just the routine of a fellow professional. "Morning, detective," she replied, giving him a polite smile. She didn't have time to dwell on small talk, not today. There was too much riding on this trial, but Caleb wasn't one to let things go so easily. He pushed himself off the car and stepped closer to her, his presence commanding. "You ready for today?" he asked. There was an edge of concern in his voice, but it was quickly masked by his usual tough guy persona. "I'm always ready," Ava responded, her voice steady, but she couldn't help but feel the weight of the day pressing on her. The cartel case was a monumental one, and though she had prepared herself for it mentally, there was a part of her that was anxious. What if things didn't go according to plan? What if they didn't win? The thought gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. Caleb's gaze softened for a moment, catching her eye. "You've got this," he said, the confidence in his tone almost surprising. Ava gave him a small nod, feeling a flicker of warmth at his words, but she quickly masked it with a professional smile. "Thanks," she said, and with that she turned and headed toward her car, the sound of her heels against the pavement mingling with the distant city noise. As she drove to the courthouse, Ava's mind wandered back to Caleb. He was always a bit of a mystery, charming yet guarded, tough yet vulnerable. There was a history there, something that shaped the man he had become. She had noticed the way his eyes sometimes clouded over, the way he would withdraw when things got too personal. He didn't talk about his past, and Ava didn't press him for answers, but she could see the cracks in his armor, and she couldn't help but wonder what kind of emotional scars he carried with him. She had learned long ago that everyone had their battles, and Caleb Foster was no exception. The difference was, while Ava wore her scars proudly, using them as fuel to drive her forward, Caleb seemed to hide his. And though she had no intention of becoming involved with him, not with everything she had on her plate, she couldn't deny the pull she felt whenever they were together. As she parked outside the courthouse, Ava shook off the thoughts of Caleb and focused on the task at hand. Today was about justice. It was about showing the city that she was more than just a woman fighting against prejudice. She was a force to be reckoned with. But as the door of the courthouse loomed ahead, she knew that this trial would test more than just her legal skills. It would test her resolve, her ambition, and the very ideals she had spent her life defending. And somewhere in the depths of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb Foster, flawed as he was, would somehow play a role in the journey that was about to unfold. The evening was quiet as Ava Sterling drove home, the familiar rhythm of her car's engine a soothing presence after the chaos of a long day at the office. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, and the city lights flickered on, casting their soft glow on the streets she had come to know so well. It had been one of those days, rushed meetings, complex legal briefs, and the weight of an impending court case that felt like it could either elevate her career or bring everything crashing down. She wasn't sure which one she was more afraid of. Her thoughts wandered briefly, shifting between the trial and her interactions with Caleb Foster. It wasn't that she was interested in him, at least not in the way he might think, but there was a quiet curiosity about him, a sense that there was more to his story than what he let others see. She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the road ahead. She had enough on her plate without complicating things. As she neared the intersection of West 15th and Oak Street, her headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. The familiar flash of red and blue lights made her stomach drop. Ava exhaled slowly, glancing at the clock, 9:47 p.m. She had been pulled over before, of course, but the timing and the area didn't sit right with her. The neighborhood wasn't far from downtown, but it was known for its issues, particularly with overzealous officers who liked to assert their authority on the city's more marginalized communities. Ava's intuition kicked in as she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. She sat there for a moment, waiting. The officers approached her car, two of them. Officer Finn Murray, tall and broad with a permanent scowl that made him look like he was always looking for a fight, and Officer Kevin Gray, shorter but no less intimidating, his eyes scanning her car with an unsettling intensity. Ava knew them both by reputation, two officers infamous for their tendency to racially profile black drivers. She could feel the tension immediately, a prickle of unease crawling up her spine. "Good evening, ma'am," Officer Murray said, his tone far from polite. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Ava kept her hands on the wheel, her voice calm but steady. "No, officer. I'm not sure. Is there a problem?" "You were speeding back there," Murray replied, pointing to the rearview mirror as if Ava hadn't already been paying attention. "And your taillight is out. It's a safety violation." Ava nodded, her gaze flicking briefly to the tail light in question. It wasn't something she had noticed, but she wasn't about to argue. She wasn't here to escalate things. "I wasn't speeding, officer, but I'll certainly have it looked at. Thank you for letting me know." Murray didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at her through the driver's side window, his eyes narrowing. Ava could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken judgment in his expression. It was something she had grown used to over the years, being watched, being treated as if she were guilty before she'd even done anything wrong. But tonight, something felt different. She wasn't going to let herself get rattled. "Step out of the car, please," Murray said, his voice suddenly firm. Ava blinked, taken aback by the abrupt demand. "Excuse me, is there a reason for that, officer?" she asked, keeping her tone even, trying to remain composed. We need to check your identification, Gray interjected, his voice colder than his partner. He was already stepping closer to her window, his hands resting on his belt. And we need to make sure you're not driving under the influence. Ava felt a knot tighten in her chest. She wasn't drunk, she knew that for certain, but this wasn't about her sobriety. This was about them finding an excuse to harass her. She had dealt with this kind of treatment before, but tonight she wasn't going to be intimidated. Officer, she began, her voice calm but firm. I am more than willing to provide my identification, but I don't understand why you're asking me to step out of my car. This is not standard procedure for a routine traffic stop. Murray exchanged a look with Gray, and something in their demeanor shifted. An unspoken decision passed between them. Without warning, Murray opened the door and roughly pulled her out of the car. Ava's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. What are you doing? She demanded, trying to pull away, but Gray grabbed her other arm. Relax, ma'am. Gray snapped, his grip tightening. You're making this worse. Ava's pulse quickened as they attempted to push her toward the back of the vehicle. I'm not resisting, she shouted, her voice rising in frustration. This is illegal. Murray sneered. You think you know the law better than we do? In that moment, the world seemed to close in around her. She was an assistant district attorney, someone who had fought for justice her entire life. Yet here she was, powerless, her body being forced to comply with something that felt so wrong. The absurdity of it, the injustice, the hypocrisy, struck her like a physical blow. She had been taught to respect the law, to believe in its integrity. But now, faced with the rawness of it all, the system she had worked so hard to navigate seemed like a distant lie. Stop resisting, Murray barked, now shouting, his voice full of anger. The words seemed to cut through the air like a whip. Ava was suddenly thrust to the ground. Her knees scraped against the rough asphalt as the officers shouted at her to calm down. But Ava was not the one losing control. They were. Before she could respond, a pair of handcuffs clicked around her wrists, and in that moment, she realized the gravity of the situation. She had been wrongfully arrested. She wasn't just a black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was a target. They dragged her to their squad car, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her skin. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to process what had just happened. Her legal mind was racing. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. This was an act of racial injustice, plain and simple. As they drove her to the station, the officers muttered to one another, their conversation laced with thinly veiled mockery. Ava could hear their words, but she didn't respond. They had won for now, but Ava knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. When they finally dropped her off at the station, the officers assumed they had intimidated yet another black woman. They believed their authority had won the day, that she would fade into the background like so many others before her. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Ava Sterling was no ordinary woman. She was a fighter, an assistant district attorney with a career rooted in justice. And this incident, this moment of injustice, was going to change everything. Ava wasn't going to let them get away with this. The days following Ava's arrest were a blur. Her world, once firmly rooted in the pursuit of justice, now felt like a delicate house of cards teetering on the edge of collapse. News of the wrongful arrest spread quickly, fanning the flames of public outrage. Some rallied behind her, applauding her for standing up to the police, while others questioned her every move, painting her as a troublemaker, an entitled woman demanding special treatment. Social media buzzed with heated debates, the hashtags Justice for Ava and racial profiling gaining traction. Ava, though, kept herself focused. Despite the public humiliation, the whispers that followed her down every hallway, she refused to let her sense of justice be drowned out. Her name had been dragged through the mud, but she would not let the narrative of her life be written by others. She was an assistant district attorney, a woman who had fought tooth and nail to uphold the law, and now it was her turn to do so for herself. Ava hired a lawyer, a seasoned civil rights attorney who had a reputation for taking on powerful institutions. Together, they began the painstaking process of gathering evidence, body cam footage, eyewitness accounts, and the officer's history of misconduct. Ava's mind was sharp, her focus unwavering. She pored over every detail, dissecting the police reports, cross-referencing witness statements, and scrutinizing every angle. Every fiber of her being was driven by a single goal: to expose the truth, to ensure that this wasn't just another case swept under the rug. But as the legal proceedings began to take shape, Ava couldn't shake the sense that something was missing. She had been through the system before, for on the other side of the courtroom, but this time it was different. Her reputation, her career, everything she had worked so hard for was on the line, and despite the evidence she was gathering, there was something gnawing at her, something deeper than the case itself. Caleb Foster, the detective she had met months earlier, had been at the scene of her arrest. He was the one who had seen everything unfold, the officer's aggression, the wrongful escalation, Ava's attempt to remain calm in the face of injustice. Yet he had done nothing. In the moments leading up to her arrest, Caleb had simply stood there, frozen in place, a silent witness to her humiliation. In the days that followed, Caleb was haunted by what he had seen. He couldn't shake the image of Ava, strong, poised, yet brought to the ground by the sheer force of injustice. He had been too afraid to intervene, too loyal to his colleagues. But now that guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. His conscience refused to let him off the hook. He spent sleepless nights replaying the scene over and over in his mind, wrestling with the question, could he have done something? Could he have stopped it from happening? As the case gained more attention, Caleb felt the weight of his silence grow heavier. His internal struggle reached a breaking point when Ava's case was officially set to go to trial. He had heard whispers around the station about how things were progressing, about the evidence being stacked against the officers who had arrested her. The story was gaining momentum, and Caleb knew that sooner or later the truth would come out. It was only a matter of time before his failure to act would become known. But the most surprising twist of all came when Ava's case was assigned to court. As the list of judges for the trial was posted, Ava's heart dropped. It seemed too surreal to be true. The judge presiding over her case was none other than Ava herself. The court had appointed her as the judge for the very case she was involved in despite the obvious conflict of interest. For a moment, the weight of the situation almost felt like too much to bear. She had been working as an assistant district attorney, but now she found herself standing in the very place she had once served, now wearing the black robe of a judge. She had spent years in the courtroom meticulously studying the law, winning cases, but never did she think she would be on the other side, both defendant and judge. The scales of justice no longer a distant ideal, but an intimate personal challenge. Ava's heart raced as the magnitude of her responsibility settled in. How could she be impartial in a case like this? How could she, of all people, sit in judgment over those who had wronged her? But Ava had never been one to shy away from a challenge. Her thoughts quickly turned inward as she prepared herself for the trial. She would not let her personal feelings cloud her judgment, and if she was to be a judge in this case, she would do so with the integrity she had always upheld. There was no room for compromise, especially not when the truth was at stake. As she prepared her opening statements, Ava thought about Caleb. She hadn't seen him since that night, but his presence lingered in the back of her mind. His silence that evening, his inaction, was a betrayal in its own way, but she knew that if he truly wanted to make amends, if he truly wanted redemption, he had to speak up. And Ava would make sure of that. She would ensure that every wrong was righted, even if it meant facing some uncomfortable truths about the world she had always believed in. The law was meant to serve justice, but in this case the law itself would need to be held accountable. As the day of the trial loomed closer, Ava felt the weight of her own convictions settle firmly on her shoulders. This wasn't just a case about a wrongful arrest. This was about something far larger. It was about dismantling the systems that had allowed this to happen and making sure that no one else would ever have to face the same fate. This fight was personal, and Ava was ready to see it through, no matter what it cost. The courtroom was a stage, and Ava Johnson stood at its center, poised and composed. She took her seat behind the judge's bench, her gavel resting just inches from her hand, a symbol of her authority, yet a constant reminder of the responsibility she now bore. Her heart still ached from the brutal injustice she had faced just weeks before, but as the room settled into an almost unnatural silence, Ava felt an unexpected surge of power. The weight of her role was heavy, but she carried it with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself. Her fingers hovered over the gavel, and for a brief moment, she hesitated. The image of that night, the flashing sirens, the harsh words, the unjust arrest, flashed through her mind like a nightmare she couldn't shake. But this was no longer just about what had happened to her. This was bigger. This was about what had been done to countless others, to communities like hers, to people who didn't have the resources or the voice to fight back. She brought her hand down firmly on the gavel. "Court is in session," she said, her voice steady, though inside her emotions were a swirling tempest. The trial had officially begun, and with it the stakes couldn't have been higher. First to take the stand were Officers Greg Murray and Daniel Gray. The two officers, known for their history of racial profiling, were now facing the very woman they had wronged. As they shuffled into the witness box, Ava couldn't help but observe their demeanor, nervous, visibly uncomfortable, their eyes darting around the room, unable to meet hers. It wasn't surprising, they knew what was coming. Their testimonies were predictable at first. Murray, the older of the two, went on about how Ava had acted aggressively during the traffic stop, claiming she had refused to comply and escalated the situation. Gray, the younger officer, nodded in agreement, repeating similar phrases, their stories aligning perfectly. They painted Ava as a troublemaker, someone who had acted out of line, someone who had provoked them. Ava listened intently, her expression unreadable, their lies woven together with practiced ease hung in the air like a noxious cloud. It was time to peel back the layers of deceit. "Officer Murray," Ava began, her voice calm, yet cutting, "you mentioned that my actions were aggressive. Can you describe what exactly I did that warranted being arrested for resisting? Was I physically threatening in any way?" Murray shifted uncomfortably. "No." But Ava interrupted, her gaze sharp. "You said I refused to comply. Can you tell the court what command I disobeyed?" Murray faltered. "Well, you didn't immediately show your license when asked, and what happened?" Next, Ava's voice never wavered. "You began raising your voice. You made it a confrontation. I remained calm despite your aggressive approach. But instead of diffusing the situation, you escalated it." "Correct." The room was still, every eye on Murray as he stammered, "Well, yes. But no further questions," Ava said, cutting him off. She turned her attention to Officer Gray, who was now visibly sweating under Ava's unflinching scrutiny. The officer's once coordinated stories began to unravel. Their answers grew more defensive, more erratic, as the truth slowly slipped through the cracks. Ava's methodical questioning exposed their inconsistencies, their reluctance to be truthful. Each lie they told was met with a sharp contradiction, small but significant details that painted a picture of misconduct. Ava's piercing gaze never left them, and she could see the realization dawning in their eyes. They were losing control. They had no room to hide. But the tension didn't end there. Caleb Foster, the detective who had witnessed the entire incident, was called to testify. Ava's pulse quickened when she saw him enter the witness stand. Their eyes met briefly, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something in his gaze, regret perhaps, or a silent apology. It didn't matter. Ava had her focus on the case, and nothing could distract her from that. Caleb was a man caught between two worlds. He had always been loyal to the force, believing in the system, even as it had failed him on multiple occasions. But now, sitting in that witness box, he was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that his silence on that night had allowed injustice to take root. Ava's questions to Caleb were direct. "Detective Foster, you were present during my arrest. You saw everything unfold. Can you explain why you didn't intervene when you saw I was being wrongfully arrested?" Caleb's throat tightened. The question hung in the air like a challenge. He had no good answer. He hesitated, looking down at his hands before lifting his eyes to meet Ava's, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what to do." "Did you know it was wrong?" Ava pressed. Caleb swallowed hard. "Yes, I knew it was wrong, but I was scared of what might happen if I said something." The courtroom held its breath. Caleb's words were a painful admission, one that would follow him for the rest of his career. Ava, her gaze unwavering, nodded slowly. "I understand, but sometimes doing the right thing means speaking up, even when it's hard, even when it feels like you might lose everything. That's what true justice requires." Caleb looked away, guilt etched across his face. Ava's words cut deeper than any legal ruling ever could, for it was in that moment that Caleb realized the cost of his inaction. He hadn't just failed Ava, he had failed himself. The officers squirmed in their seats as Ava continued to dismantle their defense, her legal brilliance lighting up the courtroom. She wasn't just fighting for her own vindication, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every victim of systemic injustice. Her calm, commanding presence was a stark contrast to the officers' defensiveness, their growing discomfort betraying the crumbling foundation of their lies. And with each word Ava spoke, the web of corruption began to unravel, not just within the police department, but within the very system that had allowed it to thrive unchecked. She wasn't merely a judge presiding over a case, she was a force of change demanding accountability in a world that often looked the other way. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and for the first time in a long time Ava felt the raw power of justice in its truest form flowing through her. The courtroom doors closed behind Ava as she stepped into the hallway, the weight of the trial still heavy on her shoulders. She had just delivered her closing remarks, and now the case was in the hands of the jury. But despite the victory she felt within the confines of the courtroom, the world outside was still full of uncertainty. The adrenaline of the trial was slowly fading, leaving a quiet exhaustion in its wake. As she walked down the hall, she didn't expect to see him. Caleb Foster, standing by the entrance, his broad frame leaning against the wall, seemed out of place. He looked like he belonged to a different world than the one Ava inhabited, a world that had never quite made room for her. And yet there he was, his presence unexpected, almost haunting. Caleb's eyes met hers, and for a moment neither of them said anything. His gaze was heavy with regret, the kind of guilt that spoke volumes. Ava's first instinct was to turn away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, but something in the air shifted, and she found herself stopping in her tracks. "Ava," Caleb said, his voice soft, almost tentative, "can we talk?" She didn't answer immediately. Her chest tightened with a mix of emotions. Anger, disappointment, and something she couldn't quite name. She had every right to walk away, to shut him out completely. After all, he had been there, had seen what happened that night, and done nothing. But there was something in the way he was looking at her now, a mixture of vulnerability and shame, that made her pause. For the first time, Ava truly saw him, not as the man who had stood idly by during her arrest, but as someone who was struggling with his own demons. She exhaled slowly, nodding her head. "You have 5 minutes," she said curtly, her voice betraying none of the emotions that churned inside her. Caleb straightened up, his posture tense, as though he was unsure how to approach her, how to even begin this conversation. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit that made Ava feel a flicker of something. Sympathy perhaps, though she quickly squashed it. He had failed her once. She had no obligation to make things easier for him now. "I don't know how to start this," Caleb began, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been trying to figure it out ever since that night. I should have done something. I should have said something, but I froze. I didn't know what to do." Ava's heart fluttered with the rush of old familiar wounds. "You didn't know what to do?" Her voice was colder than she intended. "I was the one who was arrested. Caleb, I was the one who was harassed. You didn't freeze. You stood there and said nothing." Caleb's face read a mix of shame and regret etched deeply in his features. He took a step closer, as if the distance between them was too great. "I know," he admitted quietly. "I failed you. I failed myself, and I can't fix it, but I need you to know I'm sorry for what happened, for not speaking up when I should have." Ava looked at him, her arms crossed defensively, her mind whirling with conflicting thoughts. She had spent so long building walls around herself, walls designed to protect her from the pain of racial injustice, from the hurt of people who didn't understand her struggles. But there was something in Caleb's voice, something raw, that reached through those walls. "I've been carrying the weight of that night, Ava," Caleb continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't undo what happened, but I want to make it right. I want to be better." Ava swallowed hard, the anger in her chest softening just a little. She had grown up with people like Caleb, people who were often oblivious to the pain of Black people, to the everyday struggles they faced, but she had also seen the rare moments of self-awareness, the ones where someone realized the depth of their mistakes and took responsibility for them. She didn't want to forgive him, not yet, not entirely, but in that moment she could see that Caleb was sincere. "I grew up in a world that made me feel like I had to fight for every inch of respect, every opportunity. I've been pulled over by cops like Murray and Gray more times than I can count," Ava said, her voice quiet now, the vulnerability creeping in. "I've been told I was too loud or too angry for speaking out, but I didn't have a choice. It's a part of my life, Caleb, a part of who I am." Caleb didn't interrupt, just let her words wash over him. He was listening, really listening for the first time. Ava paused, taking a deep breath. "What I don't get, what I'll never get, is how you could just stand there. You're a good man, Caleb, I can see that. But that night you were just another man with power who didn't use it when it mattered most." The silence that followed was thick, the air heavy with the weight of her words. Caleb's expression was solemn, regret written all over his face. "I know," he repeated softly. I've been trying to figure out how to make it right, how to prove that I'm not the same man I was. That night, Ava's mind raced. Part of her wanted to close the door on this conversation and never look back. She didn't owe him anything. He had his own battles to fight, and it was none of her concern. But another part of her, a quieter part, wondered if there was room for something between them, a chance for redemption, not just for Caleb, but for herself too. Could she forgive him? Could she let go of her anger long enough to allow something else to bloom? She shook her head slightly, as if trying to rid herself of the doubt. I don't know, Caleb. I don't know if I can forgive you. But I'll give you one thing. You're the only one who's owned up to what happened. That counts for something. Caleb nodded, relief flickering in his eyes, though he knew the road to her forgiveness would be long if it ever came at all. They stood in silence. For a moment, two people caught in the middle of a storm neither of them had fully understood, but something had shifted between them, something fragile, something that felt like the beginning of a new connection, uncertain and vulnerable. As they parted ways, Ava's mind lingered on Caleb's words, on his apology. Could they build something from this? Could they ever overcome the divisions between them? For the first time in a long time, Ava wasn't sure of the answer, but she wasn't ready to close the door on it just yet. The courtroom was eerily silent as Ava Sterling prepared to deliver her verdict. The weight of the moment settled over her, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just any case. It was the culmination of months of pain, struggle, and hidden truths. It was about more than the law. It was about justice. For herself, for every Black person who had ever faced racial profiling, and for the city that had turned a blind eye for too long. Her gaze flicked briefly over the defendants, Officer Greg Murray and Officer Daniel Gray, both sitting stiffly in their chairs, faces set in an expression of practiced indifference. But Ava could see the cracks, the subtle signs of unease. They had been so sure of their power, so comfortable in their privilege, but she had dismantled their story piece by piece, exposing the rot beneath their polished uniforms. Ava felt the sting of her own history, of all the years spent watching, waiting, and fighting for something as simple as fairness. She had been that Black woman pulled over too many times, been that name on a report filed under routine traffic stop that was anything but routine. Now, it was time for justice to be served, and she wasn't going to let their lies stand any longer. With a steadying breath, Ava stood tall. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm but resolute. Officer Murray, Officer Gray, this court has found sufficient evidence of your misconduct, of your actions that betrayed the trust placed in you as public servants. As she spoke, she couldn't help but notice Murray's eyes narrowing, the thin thread of his control beginning to unravel. Gray shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sweating, a look of nervous anticipation creeping across his face. Ava paused for a moment, allowing the full weight of her words to sink in. You are both hereby found guilty of racially motivated misconduct, abuse of power, and the unjust arrest of an innocent citizen, she continued, her voice unwavering, and as of this moment you will be stripped of your badges and your rights to serve as law enforcement officers. The courtroom erupted into whispers, but Ava held up a hand, silencing the noise. She wasn't done yet. I must also inform you that a deeper investigation into your actions has revealed even more troubling patterns. Your involvement in illegal activities, including widespread racial profiling and corruption within this department, has come to light. Her words hung in the air like a dark cloud finally breaking open. There was a moment of stunned silence before the defense attorney for Murray began to protest, but Ava cut him off enough. She set her tone like steel. This is no longer just about one isolated incident. It is about a systemic issue that has allowed you to continue abusing your position for far too long. As the courtroom buzzed with disbelief and shock, Ava glanced toward the back of the room. Caleb Foster was standing there watching her, his face filled with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, her something more personal. His presence was a quiet strength behind her, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Ava allowed herself to fully appreciate what he had risked to stand beside her. Caleb had come a long way. Where once he had stood by as an observer, unsure of his place in the system, now he was an active participant in the battle for justice. She knew that what had just been uncovered wasn't just the end of her fight, it was the beginning of something much larger. Caleb was a part of that. After the verdict, Caleb approached her quietly, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something softer, more earnest. His gaze was fixed on her, searching for some acknowledgement, some sign that she understood just how far he had come. Jason started, his voice low and steady. I need to tell you something. There's more to this than what's been said in court. Ava raised an eyebrow, her instincts immediately alert. What do you mean? Jason hesitated, looking over his shoulder, as if ensuring they were alone. I've been investigating Murray and Gray, he confessed, his voice almost a whisper. I've been digging into their records, their past cases. It's worse than we thought. Murray, he's been involved in more than just racial profiling. There's evidence of Brib covering up crimes in exchange for cash. Gray's been his partner in all of it. Ava's heart raced as the full magnitude of what he was saying hit her. You've been gathering evidence, and you didn't tell me. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flashed with the gravity of the situation. This was bigger than anything she had imagined. I had to do it discreetly, Jason explained, a hint of regret in his eyes. I couldn't risk alerting them, but now that we have everything, it's time to bring them down for good. Ava stood still for a moment, absorbing his words. The revelation sent a cold shiver down her spine, but it also solidified something she had known deep down. Jason was no longer just the detective caught between two worlds. He was now a man who was ready to make a stand, even at the cost of his own career. Jason stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I have to testify. I know it'll cost me my job, maybe even my future in law enforcement, but it's bigger than me. It's bigger than the force. If I don't stand up now, I'll never be able to live with myself. Ava looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. This was at the moment of truth. Jason had a choice: to save his career or to stand with her with the truth. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the conflict that had been eating at him. Without saying a word, Ava nodded. Do what's right, Jason. The truth is what matters. Jason hesitated only for a moment before turning to leave, his steps purposeful. Ava watched him go, knowing that what was about to happen would forever change both their lives. The trial had come to an end, but the battle was far from over. Jason Turner had made his choice. The corrupt officers would be exposed, their reign of abuse brought to an end. But for Ava, the true victory was not just in the courtroom. It was in the realization that sometimes justice required more than just laws. It required courage, integrity, and the willingness to stand up when no one else would. And with that, the tides of change were set in motion, one truth at a time. Ava Johnson stood outside the courthouse, watching the setting sun, a sense of peace settling over her, a new chapter in her life about to begin. Her victory in the courtroom wasn't just legal. It was a declaration that Black women could no longer be ignored by a system built to keep them down. Ava had proven she wasn't just a survivor, but a catalyst for change. For years, Ava had fought to prove her worth in a world that expected less of her due to her race and because of her gender. She had learned to hide her pain behind a smile and push through obstacles. But when she delivered her verdict, something shifted. No longer content to remain invisible, she stepped into her power and showed the world and herself that she was a force to be reckoned with. Caleb Foster, the detective who had quietly supported her throughout the case, had played a significant role in her growth. His willingness to risk his career to help her seek justice made her rethink her independence. With Caleb, she found the space to be both strong and vulnerable, accepting help without losing herself. Their bond, once born out of circumstance, began to deepen. They spent more time together, opening up about their pasts and dreams. Ava shared the challenges of growing up in a world where doors were often closed to her because of her skin color. Caleb revealed the internal conflict he faced as he tried to reconcile his love for law enforcement with the darker truths of the force. Their conversations were filled with both weight and light, bringing them closer. As Ava's success continued, she became a symbol of resilience for young Black women, particularly in the legal field. Her victory had proven that no one, no matter the odds, was powerless. But with her newfound visibility came new challenges. Ava knew she would face those who tried to undermine her, but she wasn't afraid. She had been underestimated before, and she knew how to turn that into fuel for her fire. Her relationship with Caleb remained uncertain, as their worlds were still very different. Yet the respect, admiration, and tenderness between them couldn't be ignored. Their connection wasn't perfect, but it was real. One evening, Caleb asked Ava out for dinner, a simple but profound gesture that marked the beginning of something deeper. I don't know what this is, Ava admitted softly, but I think we should find out together. Caleb smiled, his gaze steady. I'm ready if you are. Months passed, and Ava's influence grew. She became a mentor, inspiring young women to pursue careers in law and stand tall in the face of adversity. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Caleb by her side, she felt ready. The final moment came at a gala for the city's legal community, where Ava once struggled to fit in. Now she walked in, not as someone trying to prove herself, but as someone who had carved her place. Caleb, by her side, had found his own redemption. Together they stood strong, ready to build a future not defined by their past, but by the strength they had found in each other. For Ava, this was the ultimate victory. Ava Johnson stood on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker below, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The long journey that had brought her here, through battles in the courtroom, moments of self-doubt, and painful experiences, had shaped her in profound ways. She had fought for justice, not just for others, but for herself, and now, as she looked out over the city, she realized her true victory wasn't just in winning cases, it was in staying authentic, refusing to let her circumstances define her. She had always been driven to prove herself, to overcome the prejudice and limitations others placed on her. But as her career progressed, Ava discovered that the fight was about more than recognition. It was about staying true to who she was, no matter what the world expected. Her success wasn't just a personal achievement. It had become a symbol of resilience for others, particularly young Black women who saw her as proof that they too could rise above the challenges they faced. Ava's time in the courtroom, especially when she presided over the case against the officers who wronged her, had been a turning point. It wasn't just about securing justice. It was about reclaiming her sense of self. In that moment, she realized that she wasn't merely surviving the system. She was changing it, shaping a future where authenticity and courage were valued above conformity. One unexpected twist in her journey had been her relationship with Caleb Foster. Initially, she had seen him as part of the system that had failed her, but as their relationship developed, she began to see him differently. Caleb had shown her that redemption wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small, everyday choices to stand up for what's right. He had risked his career to help her bring the corrupt officers to justice, and in doing so, had proven his commitment to truth and fairness. Their bond wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was built on mutual respect, vulnerability, and a shared understanding of what it meant to fight for something greater than themselves. Through Caleb, Ava learned that love wasn't about finding someone who matched her ideals, but about finding someone who could see her for who she truly was, flaws and all. They didn't need to be perfect. They only needed to be honest and willing to grow together. As Ava and Caleb's relationship deepened, she realized that connection was at the heart of everything, whether with herself, others, or the world around her. It was the moments of honesty, vulnerability, and love that shaped her path. Despite the challenges, she had found strength in staying true to herself and in allowing others to see her for who she truly was. Ava's journey wasn't just about overcoming adversity. It was about inspiring others to do the same. She had proven that resilience, authenticity, and connection were the keys to both personal growth and lasting change. And as she stood beside Caleb ready to face whatever came next, she knew that together they could continue to make a difference one step at a time. So after all the challenges, Ava has not only won justice for herself, but also helped those around her overcome fear and injustice. She is not only a talented judge, but also a symbol of resilience and hope, a strong woman who refuses to bow to any prejudice. And beside her, Caleb, who was once part of the wrong system, now stands with her on the path of justice, proving that it is never too late to change. But Ava and Caleb's story is not over yet. They have many journeys ahead, and there will definitely be more surprises in the future. If you want to follow such inspiring and dramatic stories, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the latest videos from me. Please share this story if you feel it inspires you, and together we will continue the journey of searching for truth and justice.